in the backdrop of all of this is this rather nasty fascistic view that the big corporations are actually much better placed to run things. And as governments lose their credibility and start to collapse, those corporations are getting more and more power and they're getting ready to take over. But the other story, which is rather implies that government hasn't got a clue this week, is what happened with the Manchester Arena, which we did quite a lot of commentary at the time, didn't we, Martin, about the Manchester Arena attack, drawing questions about. Do you want to just say something about that? Because the guy who was accused of doing it, Salman Abedi, his family should most definitely have been up on the radar, and you and I have said that many times.
Well, I don't know how much time we've got to go into all of this.
Well, the Islamic Fighting Group.
Yes,
and his father was actually MI6 agent over in Libya working to kill Gaddafi, working for MI6. That was his father.
The Islamic Fighting Group's headquarters outside Libya were in Manchester. There's even a picture on the wall of the Manchester Brigade of Islamic Fighting Group. And that's because they were opposed to Gaddafi, so Annie Mashin and Dave Shaler, who we used to talk to a lot, when they were working for MI5, they uncovered, MI6 came to Dave Shaler and said, well, we're going to try and assassinate Gaddafi,
well, that's right.
and we're going to use the Islamic Fighting Group of Libya.
This got called the Gaddafi plot.
The Gaddafi plot, that's right. And of course, of the international brigades that were sent to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviets, the biggest proportion of those came from Tripoli in Libya, and they were Islamic Fighting Group. And in fact, the relationship between the Islamic Fighting Group and the British intelligence services is profound and goes back a very long way. And what came out in the court case today is that MI5 had failed in various ways, blah, 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 blah. They should have seen him coming. But of course, the judge who was in charge of it said a lot of the evidence that was given about this was given in secret. And I can't tell you what they told us, because that's going to compromise national security. And what I suspect is that will show that these individuals had close links with MI6 going back years, because Libyan Islamic Fighting Group was one of their cat's paws. Part of don't forget, Al-Qaeda was created by our own intelligence services in the 1980s. It was the British and the Americans who created it. And then the story is they suddenly went rogue and started blowing things up, and we can't control them. But of course, that's belied by what happened in Syria in recent years, where the same British intelligence services and special forces have been working with these Al-Qaeda-linked groups in Syria to try and overthrow, like the White Helmets, for example, to try and overthrow Assad. Now, I think this is the very least you could say about what happened in Manchester is because they had an intimate relationship with these people, they weren't really watching them properly.
Salman Abedi's
but it may well be worse than that.
Salman Abedi's father was called Ramadan Abedi, and he had been working with MI6 all this time. It seems to me, well, what's going on is the intelligence services, MI5 is supposed to be the security service for domestic UK, like connected with the Home Office, and MI6 with the Foreign Office outside the UK, is that they are actually running these sorts of terrorist organisations. And so it shouldn't be really that surprising if one of them decides that they're going to turn those terrorist bombs on Britain.
Well, that would be what you might...
Maybe they shouldn't run terrorist organisations in the first place.
Well, you could argue that, Tony, but then that's what they do. I mean, that's what they've been doing for years. Yeah? So you say... Well, you see, MI5 is supposed to just do stuff in Britain, but of course back in the day when Israel was part of the British Empire, or Palestine was part of the British Empire, MI5 were in charge of that. They were in charge in Kenya in the 1950s. So MI6, I mean what happened, Dave Shaler said to me, I was sitting at my desk in MI5 just reading the Daily Telegraph, and then MI6 arrived. And they started, because I was MI5, they thought, we're going to assassinate Gaddafi, and I thought they were joking. And then the next week I read about it and realised they weren't joking, that they were going to do it. And he said that MI5's got a more sort of grammar school culture, and MI6 is more like a public school culture. That's what he said. Right. But anyway, the point I would make about this is that there is a lot more to this than meets the eye. It's either because they were incompetent in not keeping an eye on them, even though they knew who they were and all the rest of it, or it may be, like other attacks that have been carried out in the West, it is actually the intelligence services who are ultimately the perpetrators.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you which of those you think, after we've heard from yesterday the Enquiry chair, Sir John Saunders, and here's a clip, and I'll put a full version of this up on our show page at thisweek.com. bbc.org.uk later. Here is his take, and here's his kind of verbal version of the report he released yesterday, which is the third and final report on Manchester Arena, which concentrates on the failings of the security service.
Finally, in my report, I deal with the issue of whether the attack should or could have been prevented by the security service and counter-terrorism policing. I have reported fully on those matters in the closed part of Volume 3 of my report, which will be seen by those who are best placed to ensure that mistakes which were made are not repeated. In the open part of Volume 3, I have included all matters which I can safely include without jeopardising national security and making our community less safe. I have set out how I have approached the issue of national security, and I shall not repeat it now, except to say that where it has been possible, without risking national security, to make public the evidence that I heard enclosed, I have done so. What I have been able to set out in the open part of Volume 3 is that I have found a significant missed opportunity to take action that might have prevented the attack. It is not possible to reach any conclusion on the balance of probabilities or to any other evidential standard as to whether the attack would have been prevented. However, there was a realistic possibility that actionable intelligence could have been obtained which might have led to actions preventing the attack. The reasons for this missed opportunity included a failure by the security service, in my view, to act swiftly enough. I am aware that revealing what I have revealed in Part 24 of my report will leave many people, and particularly the bereaved families, wanting to know more. All I can say is that I have done my best to reveal what I can. Had we not had closed hearings, I would not have been able to make the findings that I have been able to make. Closed hearings, I am convinced, were entirely necessary as part of this inquiry if it was going to achieve its aims. The consequence of that, however, is that I have not been able to reveal some of the evidence on which my findings are based, as to do so would have risked breaching national security.
Trust me, says Sir John Saunders. That was the part of his very long, rather rambling explanation of the final report. So the fact is, Martin, there seems to be very little or no oversight, not even in a public inquiry of these people. And one does wonder whether the fact that the guy who was supposed to check Abedi to see if they should have put him on the PREVENT programme and then failed to do so was just thinking, well, even if, I don't bother, no one's going to know.
Well, it's, public inquiries in this country are a stitch-up by and large. They always have been.
A lot of people say the PREVENT programme is a bit of a waste of time, but this guy, who was literally ticking every single box, including being reported to the MI5 directly on the anti-terrorist hotline by people in Manchester, they didn't even bother putting him on PREVENT.
Well, what happened, if you remember, was that the father, who was in Libya, because he'd just come back from Libya, he'd been fighting in Libya with his father, as you say, was an MI6 agent, and he said, this is a stitch-up. MI6 have stitched my boy up here. And it may well be that he didn't actually plant the bomb. We don't know, because there's often more to these than meet the eye. On 7/7, we had a French police officer come out of Scotland Yard saying, we're really worried about this because it looks as if they use C4 explosives, which is NATO standard explosives. Now,
well, if you remember Dawn Waddy, I mean, you brought this as an interesting point because we can't necessarily trust this chap. She was on Sky the day after she'd come back to where her daughter had either been killed or injured. No, I think actually, no, it was some friends of her daughter And she said, well, we saw somebody acting suspiciously on the road just near us, and we flagged it up to the security. I mean, this is before the bomb took. No one was even thinking there was a problem, and that she didn't seem to be able to speak English. She seemed to be acting in a really weird way and kind of smirking and smiling, like she knew something and she was looking over to where the bomb actually eventually exploded, and she was completely ignored by the security there on the night.
And also, of course, ignored by the subsequent police investigation, because if there's more than one person involved, and don't forget, this guy built a viable bomb. That's not quite so straightforward. Yeah. The same thing on 7/7. Eventually, they said that they made the bombs out of shampoo. Yeah, and that was the story. But in actual fact, making bombs out of shampoo, I'm looking it up on the internet, is not that straightforward. Ask any provisional IRA volunteer.
Well, I think it was the bus bombers just after 7/7 had made what they thought was a bomb, but it just started foaming, and all this kind of goo started oozing out of it on a bus.
What people find very hard to accept is that the intelligence services, far from being protectors, are enablers of this kind of terroristic attack. Not all terrorist attacks are carried out by the deep state, but a lot of the big ones certainly are. And it's been going back for years and years and years. People who are regular listeners to the show will know that we talk a lot about what happened in Italy in the 1970s. The head of the Italian Supreme Court in Posimato wrote a book that came out in 2012, La Repubblica dei Stragi Impuni. He was the investigating magistrate on many of these terrorist incidents in Italy, including the bombings of Piazza Fontana in 1969, killed 9 people, bombing of Bologna in 1987, that killed 87 people, and the police investigation showed it was the NATO intelligence services who were running those bomb attacks. That's what people find hard to believe. Not if you're in West Belfast. It's easier to believe. But in West Yorkshire, less so.
This was also worth noting that this bomb attack took place in the run-up to the 2017 election.
That's right.
And there were 2 other bomb attacks that also, attacks that took place, terror attacks. There was the London Bridge one and the Westminster Bridge one that also, just as the election was going. And what this does, it has the effect of steering the narrative in the media during that election to be all about terrorism.
Yes, and the same thing happened in Spain, if you remember, with the Madrid train bombings during the election campaign there. I think the calculation by the NATO terror masters, if we can call them that, in both cases, was that they were trying to cement Aznar in place as the People's Party Prime Minister of Spain, because he'd gone along with the Iraq War. So that by having an attack, he will then be seen to be, but you see, we were right all along, we're under attack. It didn't work in Spain because Aznar wasn't in on it, and he said it was ETA that did it, which looks stupid. And then, of course, in actual fact, in Spain, there was such a lot of opposition to the Iraq War. They said, well, no, even if it was, as you say it is, and of course, there's a question mark about what actually happened there, they voted for Zapatero, because he and the socialists, because they'd been against the war in Iraq, unlike the Labour Party.
Interesting. Here. We could also talk about Operation Gladio, but just before we do that, Martin, I'd just like to hear from one of the victims' mums, okay, and then you can have your say. Caroline Curry.
We would also like to thank Mr Warnock Casey for the respect shown to us from that very first day, when he immediately acknowledged the failures by GMFRS and apologised on their behalf, unlike all the other services. All we as families have asked for from day one is the truth, acknowledgement of failures. And a determination to make sure that those failures are fixed, so that next time, because there will be a next time, but hopefully next time there won't be as many families going through the utter heartbreak we have had to endure for the last 5 years, 9 months, 1 week and 1 day. We didn't get that acknowledgement from anyone other than GMFRS until the chairman's reports were published. Shame on you all. In this volume of the report, the Chair has recognised that there was significant missed opportunity by MI5, which, had they taken action, could ultimately have changed the course of what happened that night. He also identified a lack of information sharing between the police and the security services. We hope lessons really will be learned this time. However, there were some heroes that night, and to name a few: Sergeant Cam Hare, Inspector Mike Smith, Chief Inspector Mark Dexter, and civilians Bethany Crook, Ronald Blake and Darren Costa. This is where the medals should have gone. We have sat through 8 weeks in the Old Bailey and over 2 years here at the Enquiry. We have read countless statements, listened to hours of evidence, and we can only hope that one day the whole truth will come out and others, including the fugitive brother and parents, face justice, because we will never believe they were in this alone. Forgiveness will never be an option for such evil intentions, and those that played any part in the murder of our children will never ever get forgiveness. From top to bottom, MI5 to the associates of the attacker, we will always believe that you all played a part in the murder of our children. We will spend the rest of our lives trying to protect our boys. Because as we found out through this process, once you leave the safety of your home, you are on your own. So many people being paid that night to protect our kids, and yet so many failed in their duties. Professionals that had responsibility but clearly had other priorities. Security staff that, even when told of the danger, failed to act appropriately. Once again, we'll never forgive you. Nothing can bring Liam and Chloe back. Nothing. But we won't let them be forgotten. We have set up a charity in their names as a lasting legacy to show that from such absolute heartbreak, something positive can rise. We will continue to campaign to be allowed to register the personal detail on their death certificates, and we won't rest until all those who played a role in their deaths are brought to justice. Can we finally thank Duncan Atkinson, KC, Victoria Ailes and Adam Pater for being our voice throughout this ordeal, and our amazing team from Hogan Lovells, Scott, Haley and Helen for their constant support even on the darkest days. You will never know how much this meant to us, the families of Chloe and Liam.
So that's quite an amazing testimony there from Caroline Curry. Martin, this is pretty harrowing for anybody, and it brings it all, I suppose, home to hear her experience and her having her say, especially after hearing the inquiry chair earlier in this kind of rather stilted fashion. And what she's saying, by the way, as well, is that mothers of Manchester Arena victims say cold-hearted ministers have left them numb. Grieving families of teenage sweethearts, Liam Curry and Chloe Rutherford, want the government to change the law so they can register the deaths of their children. The parents of teenage sweethearts killed in the Manchester Arena bombing, so they've been left numb as they accuse ministers of backtracking on promises to them. Liam Curry, 19, and Chloe Rutherford, 17, were among 22 innocent people that died in that attack. Their families have been campaigning to change the law to give them the option of being involved in registering their deaths. Current legislation prevents family members from registering the deaths of loved ones who are the focus of inquests or public inquiries. It has to be done by an official instead. So they feel like they've been punched in the face after ministers dropped plans to change the law. So they told them they were going to change the law. Now they've just said, now they're saying we feel led up the garden path. They've treated us with such disrespect. It's unforgivable. We've not been listened to. They just want us to go away and quietly find a corner to grieve in.
Yes, I hear all of that, Tony. Coming back to what I was going to say before the clip, Jeremy Corbyn, as you say, was campaigning to be the Prime Minister of the country at this time.
He did quite well as well.
Well, I'm just making the point. I think that the motivation behind the bombing, which wasn't necessarily carried out by an individual, was to destabilise Jeremy Corbyn, because then he comes out, he has to say, look, the terrorists are attacking us, and there's exactly the same motivation behind the bombs in Madrid in 2003. I think it was 2004, wasn't it, in Madrid? If wasn't, we're suspect, this is all speculation, obviously, but of course what Jeremy Corbyn did, which he's quite good at, is he said, of course I condemn this, it's absolutely wrong, but of course we've got to face up to the fact that we go invading other countries like Iraq, and in actual fact they didn't expect that the public would respond in that way to it. he was able to. So instead of something that was going to be a problem for him, it became something which he was able to either A, to neutralise, or B, to make the point. Look, this is happening because of what we do. What do you think a bomb looks like when it hits a crowded place in Baghdad? It looks exactly like what it looks like in Manchester. Now, the other point is. What was the other point I was
Well, you can tell your other point after we've heard from the former head of MI5, Pauline Neville-Jones. She was on Sky, was it Sky, maybe Talk TV yesterday, giving her view on how actually MI5 has learnt its lessons from this attack.
Is this just individual human error inside MI5 with individual officers, or is there something more systemic going on, something wrong with the way MI5 is run?
No, I think it's more the first than the second. I don't think we have reason to suppose that somehow they have their priorities all wrong, or indeed that they've got fundamentally wrong techniques. I think it is the case that has been rather, I think, graphically outlined in the report, was that there was a signal failure at one point where a piece of information, we don't know what kind it was, and we don't know how explicit it was, but clearly had national security significance, wasn't acted on soon enough. And it's from that single error that a whole lot of other possible opportunities, and the judge, Sir John Saunders makes it clear, that these wouldn't necessarily have resulted in success, but an opportunity was foreclosed by not acting soon enough. Now, that's a lesson that the organisation will take to heart, and I'm sure they will have laid it down now, that information of that kind with that degree of sensitivity, even if you don't know and can't know how urgent it is, you act on it and you make it actionable immediately. So they will have amended their procedures.
Oh, apparently they've amended their procedures. So she's trying to sort of pussyfoot around there. Well, we know what she's talking about. She won't say it, but this is about this failure to... They had basically a MI5 officer decided that, even though the evidence was quite clear, that Abedi should not be referred to this PREVENT programme.
Well, that was before all this. Don't forget, he was going backwards and forwards to Libya. And he was going backwards and forwards to Libya because our special forces, the SAS and the SBS, were embedded with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group trying to overthrow Gaddafi. The plan to overthrow Gaddafi did not begin when he started to use supposedly aeroplanes on the protesters in Tripoli. There was a planned exercise called Operation Southern Mistral, which had been planned for several years, which was all going to be, but the RAF and the French Air Force were going to be in southern France, and they were going to war game a humanitarian intervention in a North African country where people had been attacked by aircraft and they were going to have to intervene. So in other words, there's evidence that they planned to overthrow Gaddafi. Now these people, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, including Abedi and his father and his brother, were part of that plan. That's what was happening. So that's what the judge will have heard. Getting
back to Pauline Neville-Jones, don't you think it's likely that when this piece of paper came in front of this MI5 officer saying, look, this guy's a complete nutcase, he's got to go on the PREVENT programme, someone tapped him on the shoulder and said, no.
He's working for us. Yeah. That's right.
So anyway,
that's what's going on here.
So that's Pauline Neville-Jones we've heard from. I think probably a good idea now to listen to another person involved. And when all this was going on yesterday, I was thinking to myself, look, I know somebody who's got in touch with me in the past, Graham Fawkes. He lost his son David in the 7/7 London bombings. And so I phoned him up. I got a hold of him and asked him what he made of this report, because of course there's quite a lot of time difference, 12 years between the 7/7 London bombings, where 50 people or so died, and the Manchester Arena attacks. So I asked Graham what was going through his mind, who lost his son David in 7/7, when he heard this announcement from the Enquiry that, oh, we're very sorry and we won't do it again, from MI5.
It was a real sense of déjà vu, because although the 7/7 attack was a little while ago now, following the inquest into that attack, what I heard today was exactly the same that we heard after the inquest into 7/7. MI5 missed the opportunity. MI5 are very sorry. They couldn't tell us quite what had happened because it was secret and it would threaten the nation. Very convenient excuse for them. We heard a number of recommendations about how easy it is, or a number of comments about how easy it is to simply, in this country, to go and buy materials from which you can make a bomb. Exactly the same as 7/7. In the Manchester attack, we heard how the emergency services were pretty dismal in their response, disconnected, disorientated, disorganised. Exactly the same as after 7/7, no change, no improvements. And Manchester attack, sadly, we know a number of people lost their lives who could well have been saved had the emergency services followed the recommendations from the inquest into 7/7. It's quite shocking, really, to think that they just completely ignored it, because it seems to me, as I heard today, these things never happen, they're very rare, we don't need to do anything. And that's exactly what happened.
I don't think most people realise what recommendations were made after 7/7 and whether or not our chief constables and our fire chiefs around the country followed them, because, of course, firefighters are not just firefighters, they're also extremely well-qualified first aiders. They're dealing day to day with car crashes and things like that, so they are incredibly valuable people to have around. And one of the things that's so extraordinary about the Manchester attack is that the police cordon that was thrown around the venue excluded the firefighters from the scene for at least half an hour, something up to 3/4 of an hour.
Well, I wasn't at all surprised to hear that, because in London, for example, at Edgware Road, where my son was killed, we know that the fire brigade arrived and were told to sit on the curb and do nothing for, I think, 15 minutes, because the police, the fire brigade and the ambulance services didn't know what was happening, weren't able to communicate with each other. So there in London, many of the first responders, and as you say, the people actually in the fire engines, actually in the police cars, are really well trained, but were unable to do anything because they didn't have any command structure in place. And that's exactly what happened in Manchester. But the thing that I found really frustrating is, following the 7/7 attacks, there was something called the Joint Emergency Services Interconnectivity Process was developed, and that was sent out to all chief constables and all the 43 forces in Britain, to all the fire brigades, to all the paramedics, and gave very clear instructions on the events of a major incident, not just a terrorist attack, but a major incident, how the command and control and communication system should work. A year before Manchester, that process was audited nationally, and shockingly was found that although the senior officers, chief constables and chief executives of the Ambulance Trust, knew about it, they didn't put in place any training. They didn't tell anybody that the system existed. So the day-to-day operational staff didn't even know that such a process of interconnectivity, so they could all work together, didn't even know it existed, let alone had any training. So that report was written a year before Manchester. It was highlighted to all the senior people that should know these things, and they did nothing about it. And when Manchester happened, exactly as predicted in this report, happened. Chaos. People not going to where they should do. Fire brigade not being allowed into the service. Paramedics not being allowed into the service. And people died. It's absolutely shameful.
So that's Graham Fawkes there, spoke to me yesterday. Amazing, really, to hear. It's not surprising his first words he used to me, Martin, were déjà vu.
Well, there's an awful lot of similarities, isn't there? One of the things that occurs to me is that you're not letting outsiders into the crime scene, as it were, because there are things that need to be removed from the crime scene.
Oh, maybe. And also, of course, that exactly the same happened to the Westminster Bridge attack.
Indeed.
Everybody was kept
CCTV.
out. Well, I know, but there was a report of what they did is the police said there's an active shooter. There was no active shooter, and they kept everybody out. In fact, nobody was allowed anywhere near the scene. So, I mean, if there was an active shooter, obviously you'd be saying that, but there wasn't, and people were excluded for a long period of time. The next person we're going to hear from, and of course the full interview with Graham I'll pop up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk later, is the lawyer for the families, a guy called Richard Scorer.
Today's report has been deeply painful to read, but also eye-opening. On the issue of the preventability of this attack, inevitably the report provides less information than we would have wanted. But it is now very clear that there was a failure to properly assess key intelligence about Salman Abedi, a failure to put it into proper context, and, most catastrophic of all, a delay in acting on it. As a result of these failures, at the very least, a real possibility of preventing this attack was lost. This is a devastating conclusion for us. The failures exposed in this report are unacceptable. The public are entitled to expect that information of national security importance will be acted on speedily and, crucially, that the system will ensure that this happens. It must do so in the future. We note that Sir John will be making recommendations in his closed report. We trust that these recommendations will be acted on and that Parliament will be vigilant in monitoring their implementation. We welcome the other conclusions and recommendations in this report. It is clear that Salman Abedi should have been referred to prevent. It is clear that the education system needs to be more vigilant in picking up signs of radicalisation. It is clear that Didsbury Mosque turned a blind eye to extremism in its midst. Sir John's report today contains many lessons. We must heed every one of them and make the necessary changes urgently. On 22nd of May 2017, thousands of people left their homes to attend a concert at Manchester Arena. 22 of those would never return home. Those killed and injured in this murderous attack had every right to feel safe and protected. But as this inquiry has demonstrated, they were failed at every level, before, during and after this horrific attack. Even now, some families feel let down by the government's refusal to allow them to register their loved one's death, which for some is a key part of the grieving process and is now being wrongly denied to them. Finally, we want to pay tribute to Sir John Saunders and the Enquiry legal team for their unwavering determination to uncover the truth. We thank the Enquiry support staff and the Resilience Hub for their support throughout. As this process now ends, we pay tribute to those who lost their lives. We also ask that our privacy is respected as we process the inquiry's findings. Thank you.
That's the lawyer Richard Score of 411 of the families, the victims of Manchester. Martin, one of the things that he said there which shocks me, because again, echoes of 7/7, is that there was this mosque, Didsbury Mosque, where it looks as if there was maybe some kind of intelligence outfit operating in there. Something that intelligence would, I'm sure, argue, well, we wanted to have somewhere where these people would go if they were extremists, so we could keep an eye on them. Now, I'm sure you'll remember from 7/7, Finsbury Park Mosque was being basically run, there's a faction in that mosque being run by MI5.
Well, that's right. And the people who ran the mosque weren't happy about those people coming in at all. No. And in fact, they were telling the police, well, you know, these people are dodgy. What's missing from all of this is people's understanding of the history of NATO intelligence service terrorism, because it's actually historical fact. You can't get round it. In the 70s and the 80s in Italy, the intelligence service, SISMI, working with MI6 and the CIA, were behind all the terrorism in the country. The right-wing terrorism, the left-wing terrorism, the kidnap of the Prime Minister. And we've got a book written by the former head of the Supreme Court, the same level of judicial authority that Sir Keir Starmer had as Director of Public Prosecutions here. Yeah? And in the Piazza Fontana bomb in 1969, there's a brilliant drama documentary film that came out in 2016 about it. The police, there was a kind of strategy of tension going on.
Well, this is what I want you to come to. What is the point of MI5 actually being behind these sorts of attacks, or MI6 or whoever?
The point about this,
maybe even a foreign intelligence service.
Don't forget, Al Qaeda was created by our intelligence services. It didn't exist, and then we created it. Okay. It was created by the Safari Club of the French, the British, and various others. We created Al Qaeda. And as Robin Cook pointed out, Al-Qaeda just means the base, and that was a database that was held in Jordan in Amman of all these jihadis from all over the Middle East who were armed and trained by our special forces and then infiltrated into Afghanistan.
Okay.
So the links, and of course we have very close links with the Saudi Mukhabarat. Yeah. So people can't. It's very hard to explain, especially to people who suffer.
Well, no, I think you've done a pretty good job, actually, and particularly saying that actually this could have been part of a kind of anti-Corbyn campaign going on in that general election.
It didn't work.
Well, it did, because he didn't become Prime Minister, did he?
Yeah, but in actual fact, it didn't dent his opinion poll ratings, because what he said was, I totally condemn this, but people have got to understand that you know, if we're going to go to war in other countries, this is what it's like.
Press
and
on the back of
it.
A
lot of people said, yeah, I can see
Martin, there was a lot of other press on the back of it saying, oh, this guy's in bed with terrorists, wasn't there?
Well, that's what they hoped would happen. But in actual fact, because
nobody believed it. Well, I'm sure some people did.
Jeremy Corbyn did exactly the right thing.
A
lot of people listened and said, look...
Many people may have well have been put off the voting for Jeremy Corbyn, particularly in the red wall seats, what we now call, because they'd seen all this stuff about how he was a terrorist.
Yes, and that would have been the motivation behind NATO intelligence services doing it. But it didn't necessarily work, same as it didn't work in Madrid. The Madrid train bombings were incredibly suspicious.
So let's just draw a line under this now, and I'll leave the final word to Graham Fawkes, who will talk about, what's going on within amongst the families of the victims of these terror attacks.
Is there a general disquiet amongst the families of victims of these attacks, do you think?
Well, I know for a fact, I'm in contact with a great number of them, and we have our own little groups, and it's very clear that we're all upset, but it really is a case of what can we do? Nobody listens. After 7/7, for example, and the inquest, I had a personal meeting with the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, in her office in London, and went through the report with her and said, why don't anybody, at this moment, anybody can walk into a wholesaler and buy 10 kilos of hydrogen peroxide without any questions being asked. That's not the case in the rest of Europe. Why aren't we doing something about it? And she said, oh, it's too hard. It would be too hard to do. I asked her about the interconnectivity of the emergency services, and she said, oh, yes, we're working on that. Well, we saw what happened in Manchester, didn't we? So I think we're all of that mind that what can you do?
How would you answer that question yourself? Because something clearly needs to change, doesn't it, Graham?
Oh, gosh. The problem is there's no votes in it. MPs are vote chasers, aren't they? And there's no votes in making a whole hullabah about being the MP that's holding the security services to account. How does that appeal to any individual constituency voter? It doesn't. So I think that's the real problem there.
So that's Graham Fawkes there, ending our report on Manchester Arena report. Then I'll put full interviews up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk with the ex-boss of MI5 and with Graham too.